Please welcome Lara Setrakian, Matt Mahan, Maria Teresa Kumar, and Joe Rospars.
Does this work? You go around?
Well, it is so great to be here with three fascinating change makers in civic engagement. Raise your hand if you consider civic engagement relatively high on your personal agenda. Oh, great. Raise your hand. Yeah, great. They're very happy. You've made them very happy. Raise your hand if you consider abortion. What are some of the issues we talked about earlier? Environment, or student debt. Just those three. Or Black Lives Matter is one of your priority issues. I can't vote. I asked the question. But so this notion that what we care about drives our involvement, which drives our registration, which drives our participation, all of you guys are in that mechanism and helping accelerate it in our age. So just going down the line, help us understand, starting with Matt, what problem are you solving and how are you doing it?
Sure. So at Brigade, we're focused on solving the voter engagement and empowerment problem. We start by helping voters, and there are about 155 million registered voters in the US who, in our view, participate far less than they could and they really should. So we start by connecting them to their unique voter file record and then use that to map them to their political districts, their representatives, the choices that are on their ballot. And most importantly, we are building a network that actually connects them to one another so that they can collectively advocate and vote in ways that are aligned with their values.
What's wrong with the way it happens now?
I think in a word, it's unrepresentative.
He's laughing. I got a chuckle out of him.
Yeah. It's a big question. I think in a word, it's unrepresentative. Our system is hardly nearly as representative as it should be. I met a state senator from New York a couple nights ago here who was elected with 10,000 votes to represent a district of 350,000 New Yorkers. So there's a problem when that 10% comes from a very narrow set of experiences and interests, and they're choosing who represents and therefore makes decisions on behalf of a large group of people.
So what's your argument to the rest of the populace? Why do they have to jump in the fray?
Well, I think as you pointed out in the intro, no matter what issue you care about, ultimately it runs into the political system. And if you want to create change in the world, you're going to need elected officials passing laws, changing regulations, budget priorities. That's the greatest lever we have as a society to affect most of the issues that we really care about. So I think you've got to get out there and be counted and make sure that your values are represented day to day in our representative democracy.
Maria Teresa, you agree with everything he said, of course. You've spent more than a decade working this problem for a specific community. How have you done it and what have you learned?
So I think that we are living in a really finite moment when it comes to our democracy, and part of it is that we have to figure out how do we modernize as quickly as possible. And one of the things that we find is that the millennial generation is much larger than the baby boomers, but they're underperforming for their numbers. Yet we see them marching for immigration. We see them marching for Black Lives Matter, for a wage for 15, for choice. We see them marching for the environment, and more recently we also saw them marching for LGBT issues. So collectively you actually have, that is the millennial agenda. And that is basically what you can argue is on the political agenda for this year. Why? Because for the very first time, these votes are also going to impact the next 25 years because we have in front of us a Supreme Court who's increasingly aging. So they're basically, the average age of the Supreme Court right now is 77 years old. So if you are trying to figure out what you care about the next 25 years, we need those individuals that basically came out and marched for the last 10 years to participate this year. We focus specifically on American Latino millennials because they're the fastest growing demographic of young voters. And what I mean by that is that by 2032, I know this is 2030, but by 2032, we're going to have 17 million new Latino voters on the rolls. Today, there's 27 million. So we're going to almost triple what we have today, and we have to figure out how do we get them in quickly. So to answer that, we basically developed Voter PAL. And VoterPal basically takes voter registration out of the hands of an organization or party and says, you know what, in order for us to register as quickly as possible, I need every single person in this room to start doing voter registration. And it's incredibly easy. It scans the back of your ID, and it allows you to start registering folks just as quickly. We developed it, one, because we weren't meeting the need back in 2012, and not just Voto Latino, but the whole, all of the campaigns and organizations. We registered 623,000 young Latinos and change. That was a high five, except that year, 800,000 Latinos turned 18. So we weren't even meeting the need. And we developed it peer-to-peer because we know that Latinos and millennials in general, their number one news source is each other. So by creating an app that is easy to is basically super easy to manage and giving you guys the onus of, wait, we didn't register enough voters, we gave it back to you guys. We need incredible help because we have 52 days until the election, and we're not near the amount of people that we actually need to register in order to increment the pie.
Mm-hmm. So Matt, you've built a product on the very similar dynamics, this notion that people are pulling each other into what they care about.
That's right, yeah. So about a week ago, we rolled out what we call our social ballot guide that allows people to fill out their ballot for the offices and ballot props that they have confidence in, but then importantly, they can share that with their friends so they can exchange information. And so the idea of building this voter network is to crowdsource the best ideas and information from across your social networks to fill out a ballot collaboratively. That also gives voters more power because as they vote collectively, their voice carries a lot more weight and it can be organized around the issues that people care about.
Give us a story. Give me something that's happening on Brigade that surprised you, that connected people in a new way.
Well, just a few weeks ago, a local elected official in San Francisco engaged in a long back and forth with a local reporter about housing affordability. And that was one of those issues that a lot of us out in San Francisco, where our company is based, care about, think is really important, and frankly don't know where to begin. And so to see citizens and a local representative and a member of the press all discussing and debating, which carries right into how people vote for local ballot props and local offices, to me really points to a better, more efficient, more responsive way of managing our democracy in the future.
So in the decade plus that Maria Teresa has been doing her thing and that Matt has been baking what would become Brigade Media, Joe was in the trenches, revolutionizing political mobilization as we know it. This digital thing is really new in a way, and you were involved in President Obama's first campaign, second campaign. What's going on, and what is different about this moment?
Well, I think the political moment is obviously unprecedented and something that we haven't seen before, but our work is with the Democratic Party and Hillary, and so we're nose down on that type of stuff to make sure that the Democratic Party is the grassroots fountain of energy and a place where people can go. But there's obviously work to do with the party, but also all advocacy organizations, especially ones that have been around, that have a brand, that have a legacy, to transform, to be more open to the energy and to seize the opportunities that are going on out there. And so we work as advisors to try to help these organizations that are grounded and live for their members, their volunteers, their small donors, to build in more accountability and more people-driven nature to them. And that's something that's being litigated in a real way in terms of how candidates decide to run their campaigns, how organizations decide to raise their money in galas or in direct mail or in digital. And so to try to bend organizations and tendencies towards something more people-driven to capture the spirit of what we're all talking about here.
And how is it going? What does it look like?
Well, it's tempting to say that one of the candidates is teaching a lot of bad people how to do things more effectively. But I think that it should be a lesson when we look at the campaign finance reports that are coming out just now, and for the first time you have the Republican nominee raising a lot of money in small dollar increments. That's a little bit scary as a Democrat, but it also should be a lesson that it doesn't take that many people chipping in order to make a big difference. And so that's something obviously everybody learns in their work, and especially our line of work. But whether they intend good or will is a separate question. But there is the possibility for movements and organizations to spring up from scratch with an orientation to go make sure that they mobilize these people, because the whole, when you do that, is greater than the sum of its parts.
So Matt, you're seeing people mobilize around specific issues. So is Maria Teresa. Do you worry First, what are the dynamics when you see super passionate people on either side of an issue and it gets hot? And is there something about that that's worrying you these days?
You know, actually, we've designed our debates on Brigade to show multiple sides of an issue, so we allow people to agree or disagree with a statement of belief and then leave reasons, and then the crowd upvotes the best arguments on either side. And so I actually think there's a fair bit of give and take and education that goes on. I'd also make the case that when you break things down by issues, as I know you know a lot about, you can go deeper, learn more, and then see how people align with one another. And what we find is that these big labels of Democrat and Republican, and I should say that Brigade is a nonpartisan, neutral platform for civic engagement. When we break things down by issue, we find that the big labels of Democrat, Republican, conservative, and liberal don't really hold water. People have, as Chris Rock famously said, I've got my things I'm conservative about, and I've got my things that I'm liberal about. And I think that's somewhat true, and we're seeing that on Brigade. The electorate's much more complicated than the two-party system would imply.
Do you see something similar?
Well, I think the increased challenge is what political parties, in order for them to win, they basically need 51%. So once they reach that 51% threshold of whatever mixture of voters, they basically say, I don't need to invest anymore. And the work that we're trying to do is we recognize that an actually strong, robust democracy is expanding the pie of participation. And that is why we focus specifically on the largest growing demographic, but also trying to bring in our allies, whether they're Muslim American, Asian American, and increasingly African American, because in order to drive a platform, which you're trying to do, is we actually need to have maximum participation, and that's not in the interest of the parties. What you'll find a lot of times is that organizations, because we are bootstrapped for most parts, we have to try to figure out how we can be as efficient as possible. But when people say, well, why does participation matter? I know we've had this conversation. I always like to use the two examples. One is that there was a young, I met about two years ago, I met this communications guy out of Florida, and his buddy's like, oh yeah, he ran for a special election, but he lost by 60 votes. I'm like, oh really? He's like, oh, that's kind of a shame. And the guy's like, yeah, but ask him who he ran against. Marco Rubio. Talk of a completely different trajectory, right? Like every vote counts. But then you also have the perfect example of Ferguson. In 2012, Ferguson participated by 51% of their electorate. The following year, when they had to choose their mayor, who was going to go ahead and choose their sheriff and their police department, basically they saw a drop of 51% the previous year to 6%. So when folks are saying that you get the government you pay for, you sort of are. And so our whole thing is like trying to teach as much as possible to this generation. We know that only 8 states actually require civic engagement education in order to graduate from high school. We also know that 51% of our classrooms right now are people of color, mostly immigrants. So where are they getting that civic education? So that's why the work that that you're doing as far as trying to expand the pie, expand conversation of why, and the work that you're trying to do to better other organizations is incredibly important, because the system is broken because we basically have unplugged the key areas of where people would gather and get information, and that was the classroom for the most part.
Where do you see this all going in the next decade?
Gosh, I think it's going to be messy.
You have 19 seconds.
19 seconds. I think it's going to be messy, but I think that even as political events unfold, I think the lesson is going to be that the participation is the key, and that we have tactile control over what happens for good and for ill.
Please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers. Thank you.